There is something endlessly fascinating about humanity's desire to speak with the unseen. Across centuries and civilizations, people have searched for hidden knowledge, secret power, and influence over forces they believed shaped destiny from behind a veil. The Goetia emerges from that deep current of human curiosity, standing not merely as an old mystical text, but as a window into how people once understood power, authority, fear, and the unknown. Rather than seeing it as a simple manual of supernatural practice, it helps to view it as a symbolic map of the human psyche, where invisible forces represent inner struggles, ambitions, and the eternal tension between control and chaos. At its heart, the work presents a structured hierarchy of spiritual entities, each described with distinct personalities, abilities, ranks, and symbolic attributes. This careful organization reflects a worldview that believed the universe itself operated through order, rank, and layered authority. Nothing was random. Everything had position and purpose. The invisible realm was imagined almost like a royal court or military command, mirroring the political systems familiar to the societies that preserved the text. Kings ruled over legions, nobles commanded servants, and every being had defined responsibilities. Such a structure reveals how people projected their social realities onto the cosmos, making the unknown feel navigable and, perhaps, negotiable. Yet beneath the elaborate classifications lies something far more human. The spirits described often embody powerful emotions and desires: knowledge, love, influence, revenge, wealth, secrecy, transformation. They represent cravings that live inside every person. When someone sought access to these forces, it symbolized more than a supernatural request. It expressed the timeless longing to gain mastery over life's uncertainties. Wealth might disappear. Relationships could collapse. Enemies might rise. The future felt unstable. In a world where science offered few explanations and institutions provided limited security, mystical systems offered psychological reassurance. They suggested that hidden patterns existed and that disciplined individuals could tap into them. What is particularly striking is the emphasis on precision, discipline, and mental focus. The text does not portray power as something granted casually. Instead, it implies that authority over unseen forces demands preparation, clarity of intention, emotional control, and respect for boundaries. Symbolically, this mirrors an important truth: the mind cannot command what it does not understand. Whether dealing with inner fears or external challenges, scattered attention leads to confusion, while structure brings confidence. Ritualized focus becomes a metaphor for psychological readiness. Another layer of meaning emerges in the way these entities are described as neither purely evil nor purely good. They are complex, capable of providing assistance yet also associated with danger if approached carelessly. This moral ambiguity reflects a mature recognition that power itself is neutral. Fire can cook food or burn a home. Wealth can build opportunity or fuel corruption. Influence can guide or manipulate. The responsibility lies not in the existence of power, but in the intention of the one who seeks to wield it. Such a perspective moves beyond simplistic ideas of light versus darkness and instead highlights personal accountability. The ceremonial elements surrounding the system also reveal an understanding of human psychology that feels surprisingly modern. Symbols, geometric designs, repeated phrases, and strict procedures create an atmosphere that heightens concentration and emotional intensity. These tools focus the mind, much like meditation practices or performance rituals used by athletes and artists today. When a person believes deeply in a structured process, their confidence strengthens, fear diminishes, and their actions gain conviction. Whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, the result is the same. Ritual creates a bridge between intention and action. Fear also plays an important role throughout the work. The unknown has always carried both danger and attraction. By naming, ranking, and describing mysterious forces, the text transforms vague anxiety into defined imagery. Once something has a name and shape, it becomes less overwhelming. In this way, the system acts as an ancient method of managing uncertainty. Rather than fearing a formless darkness, individuals could imagine specific intelligences with predictable behaviors. This reframing makes chaos feel negotiable rather than absolute. There is also a subtle exploration of authority. The practitioner is portrayed not as a passive observer but as someone, a person uncertain of their own intentions cannot convincingly direct external forces. The imagery of commanding powerful beings becomes a dramatic metaphor for self-command, the ability to control impulses, focus attention, and act with deliberate purpose. Over time, the text has influenced literature, art, and popular culture, shaping how generations imagine magic and the supernatural. Its lasting presence is not simply due to mysticism, but because it speaks to universal psychological experiences, the wish to understand hidden systems, the desire to feel empowered in uncertain times, and the search for methods to transform intention into tangible results. Even for modern readers who interpret its contents symbolically rather than literally, the themes remain relatable. Seen through this lens, the work becomes less about summoning external entities and more about confronting internal landscapes. The many described forces can be understood as reflections of ambition, fear, curiosity, creativity, and the shadow aspects of personality that people often avoid acknowledging. Engaging with such symbols encourages introspection. It invites a person to consider what they truly seek, what they fear, and how they handle responsibility when pursuing influence. This deeper interpretation opens an intriguing path forward, because once the surface imagery fades, what remains is a timeless exploration of power, discipline, and human desire, and understanding how these forces interact reveals even more about why such systems endured for centuries. Power becomes far less mysterious when you begin to see it as a relationship rather than a possession. One of the most intriguing ideas suggested through these old symbolic systems is that influence is not something a person simply grabs and keeps forever. It is negotiated, directed, maintained through awareness and discipline. The dramatic imagery of commanding hidden forces reflects a deeper truth about life. Control is not about domination, but about alignment. A scattered mind, driven by impulse and emotional turbulence, struggles to guide even its own decisions. But a focused mind, clear in intention and steady in emotion, naturally shapes circumstances with greater effectiveness. This symbolic relationship with power mirrors how people navigate modern systems like business, leadership, or personal ambition. Success rarely comes from brute force alone. It depends on preparation, strategy, patience, and the ability to understand complex dynamics. In this sense, the ceremonial precision described in ancient traditions resembles the preparation rituals of high performers today. A musician rehearses until every movement becomes fluid. An athlete follows strict routines to prepare mentally and physically. An investor studies patterns, controls emotional reactions, and waits for the right moment. Structure builds confidence, and confidence allows decisive action. Another subtle layer of meaning appears in the way knowledge is treated as something earned rather than freely given. Hidden information is portrayed as valuable precisely because it requires effort, discipline, and readiness. This reflects an enduring human pattern. People respect what demands commitment. When something requires patience and study, it feels powerful and transformative. On a psychological level, the journey toward understanding strengthens the individual more than the information itself. The process builds mental resilience, emotional control, and self-trust. The dramatic language of hidden hierarchies also mirrors how humans try to make sense of complex systems. Whenever reality feels overwhelming, the mind seeks structure. People create categories, chains of command, and layered explanations to make uncertainty feel manageable. In earlier eras, unseen forces explained sudden illness, unexpected fortune, or dramatic shifts in destiny. Today, people use economic models, psychological theories, and scientific frameworks for the same purpose. The tools have changed, but the underlying need remains the same. Uncertainty feels less frightening when it appears organized. There is also a powerful exploration of desire running beneath the surface. Many of the abilities attributed to mysterious forces revolve around influence over relationships, access to hidden knowledge, protection from threats, and control over material outcomes. These desires remain timeless. People want stability in an unpredictable world. They want to be respected, secure, informed, and capable of shaping their futures. The symbolic system externalizes these wishes, giving them form and personality. By imagining desire as something outside oneself, it becomes easier to approach, negotiate with, and attempt to direct. At the same time, consequences. This reflects an important psychological truth. Intensity without balance destabilizes judgment. When emotions override discipline, decisions become reckless. The symbolic warnings woven into ancient systems mirror real-world experiences where impulsive actions create long-term problems. The theme of boundaries also appears repeatedly. Respecting limits, maintaining clarity of purpose, and approaching powerful forces with composure are treated as essential. Symbolically, this emphasizes emotional regulation. People who lack internal boundaries struggle to manage external challenges. They overreact, misjudge situations, and become overwhelmed. But those who develop calm awareness can face complexity without panic. Emotional steadiness becomes a form of quiet authority. Another fascinating dimension is the role of symbolism itself. The human mind responds deeply to imagery, ritual, and atmosphere. Symbols communicate meaning faster than long explanations. A uniform conveys authority. A courtroom's design commands respect. A national flag evokes identity and loyalty. In similar ways, elaborate symbolic systems create psychological environments that heighten focus and seriousness. They signal that one is entering a deliberate mental state where intention matters. This shift in mindset can dramatically influence perception and performance. Over time, what once seemed supernatural can be understood as sophisticated psychological framing. Ritual becomes a method of concentrating attention. Incantations resemble focused affirmations. Protective symbols function like mental anchors that reduce fear. Hierarchies represent structured thinking. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, these elements guide the mind into heightened awareness. And heightened awareness often leads to sharper decisions and stronger presence. There is also an undeniable confrontation with the shadow side of human nature. Ambition, envy, anger, pride, and obsession are not denied or hidden. Instead, they are acknowledged as forces that exist within every person. Giving these impulses symbolic form allows individuals to examine them more honestly. Ignoring darker emotions does not remove them, it only drives them deeper into the subconscious where they influence behavior indirectly. By facing inner complexity directly, a person gains maturity and self-knowledge. Seen from this perspective, the entire framework becomes a dramatic exploration of self-mastery. The external theater of commanding forces mirrors the internal process of organizing thoughts, regulating emotions, and directing personal energy toward meaningful goals. What appears mystical on the surface can also be understood as a poetic representation of psychological development. And once power is understood as something cultivated within rather than summoned from outside, a deeper question naturally begins to emerge about responsibility, intention, and what it truly means to influence the world without being consumed by the very forces one seeks to control. There comes a point where the search for control begins to reveal something unexpected. The real challenge is not influencing the outside world, but understanding the forces moving quietly within. When people first encounter symbolic systems of power, their attention naturally focuses on external results. They think about changing circumstances, gaining advantages, protecting themselves from uncertainty, or acquiring knowledge that others do not possess. Yet over time, a more subtle realization begins to form. The mind interpreting these symbols is itself a vast and largely unexplored landscape, filled with competing impulses, hidden fears, silent ambitions, and emotional patterns shaped by years of experience. The dramatic language of commanding unseen forces can be understood as a metaphor for bringing order to this inner complexity. Thoughts often move unpredictably. Emotions rise and fall without warning. Desires conflict with responsibilities. Fear can distort perception, while overconfidence can cloud judgment. Without self-awareness, a person becomes reactive, pulled in different directions by internal currents they barely recognize. In this state, even small challenges feel overwhelming because there is no stable center from which to respond calmly. Symbolic frameworks that emphasize discipline and structure point toward an important psychological principle: clarity creates authority. When a person learns to observe their own thoughts without immediately acting on them, a gap appears between impulse and decision. In that gap lies freedom. Emotional reactions lose some of their control, and deliberate choice becomes possible. This is a quieter and more meaningful form of power than dramatic displays of focus, intention, and emotional composure are treated as foundations rather than afterthoughts. This reflects a truth seen in every field of performance. A negotiator entering an important discussion must manage tone and body language carefully. A leader addressing a crisis must project calm even when facing uncertainty. A surgeon must maintain steady concentration despite pressure. Preparation is not only technical, it is psychological. The mind must be trained to remain balanced under strain. Ritualized processes mirror this training by encouraging deliberate mental states. Repetition strengthens focus. Structured environments reduce distraction. Clear sequences reduce hesitation. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns in performance routines that help individuals enter states of heightened concentration. The environment signals to the mind that it is time to shift from scattered awareness to purposeful engagement. What once appeared mystical can also be understood as an early exploration of cognitive conditioning. The idea of negotiation rather than force also carries deep significance. Influence rarely responds well to aggression alone. Whether in relationships, leadership, or personal growth, pressure without understanding often creates resistance. Patience, timing, and awareness of subtle dynamics produce far better results. Symbolically, this resembles engaging with complex aspects of oneself. Suppressing fear entirely can make it stronger. Denying anger can turn it into quiet resentment, but acknowledging emotions calmly allows them to be processed and integrated. This balanced approach reflects emotional intelligence long before the term existed. Instead of dividing experiences into rigid categories of good and bad, it recognizes that every impulse contains information. Fear can signal genuine risk. Anger can highlight violated boundaries. Desire can reveal meaningful aspirations. Problems arise not from the existence of these emotions but from losing perspective. When feelings dominate awareness, judgment narrows. When they are observed with patience, they become guides rather than obstacles. There is also an important relationship between mystery and meaning. Human beings are naturally drawn to what they do not fully understand. Mystery invites imagination, and imagination gives experiences emotional depth. Systems filled with symbolic richness engage the mind more powerfully than plain instruction. They create memorable impressions that linger and influence thought patterns long after the experience ends. In this way, symbolism becomes a tool for deep learning rather than simple decoration. Over time, engagement with complex symbolic systems encourages introspection. A person begins to ask deeper questions. What motivates my choices? Why do certain fears repeat? What kind of influence do I truly want to have? These reflections gradually shift attention away from external control toward internal alignment. Goals become clearer. Decisions feel less reactive. Confidence grows not from illusion but from understanding personal strengths and limitations. This internal alignment naturally affects outward behavior. Calm individuals communicate more effectively. Focused individuals waste less energy. Self-aware individuals build healthier relationships because they recognize their own patterns rather than projecting blame. In this sense, mastery of the inner world quietly transforms external outcomes without dramatic displays of force. Eventually, the symbolic language of power reveals its most valuable lesson. Authority begins with responsibility. The ability to influence situations, people, or outcomes carries ethical weight. Intentions shape consequences. Actions driven by clarity tend to create stability, while actions driven by ego or impulse often create unintended harm. Recognizing this connection encourages humility. True strength does not seek control for its own sake but aims for balanced, constructive impact. And as this understanding deepens, curiosity shifts toward an even more profound question, not how to command power, but how to live wisely with it, ensuring that influence serves growth rather than feeding the very shadows one has worked so carefully to understand. With growing awareness, the pursuit of power slowly transforms into a pursuit of balance. What once seemed like a quest to influence forces outside oneself begins to feel more like a lifelong practice of aligning thought, emotion, and action. This shift changes everything. The need to dominate softens into the desire to understand. Urgency gives way to patience. The dramatic imagery of control fades, replaced by a quieter recognition that stability, clarity, and restraint create deeper influence than force ever. Their decisions carry the weight of haste. But when someone responds with awareness, they create space between event and action. That space allows perception to widen. Alternatives become visible. Consequences become easier to anticipate. This pause, though subtle, often determines whether a situation escalates into conflict or evolves into resolution. The symbolic language of structured systems highlights the importance of this composure. Precision and order are not simply aesthetic preferences, they represent mental discipline. A disordered mind struggles to prioritize. It jumps between fears and desires without direction. But an organized mind evaluates situations with greater objectivity. It can hold multiple possibilities without becoming overwhelmed. Order in thought creates steadiness in action. Another quiet insight emerges through the relationship between patience and timing. Many outcomes cannot be forced without creating resistance. Seeds grow according to natural rhythms. Trust develops gradually through consistent behavior. Opportunities appear when preparation meets the right moment. Trying to accelerate these processes often leads to frustration. Symbolically, this reflects the idea that influence flows more easily when actions align with underlying conditions rather than pushing against them. Timing requires awareness, and awareness depends on presence. A distracted mind misses subtle signals. It overlooks changes in tone, shifts in behavior, and emerging patterns. But attentive observation reveals details that guide wiser decisions. This applies equally to personal growth. Recognizing emotional patterns as they arise allows adjustments before habits solidify. Small corrections made early prevent larger problems later. There is also a deeper understanding of restraint woven into the philosophy of balance. Not every impulse deserves expression. Not every opportunity deserves pursuit. The ability to say no reflects strength of direction. Without restraint, energy scatters across too many aims, producing shallow results. Focused effort, guided by clear intention, generates meaningful progress. Restraint protects attention, and attention shapes achievement. In human relationships, balanced influence becomes especially important. Attempts to control others through pressure or manipulation often create silent resistance. People may comply temporarily, but trust weakens. Genuine influence grows through credibility, consistency, and empathy. When others feel understood rather than dominated, cooperation becomes natural. This form of influence is quieter but more durable. Emotional balance also changes how challenges are perceived. Difficulties no longer appear purely as threats but as information. Setbacks reveal weaknesses in strategy. Conflict exposes miscommunication. Failure highlights areas needing refinement. With this perspective, obstacles become teachers rather than enemies. Frustration decreases because each experience contributes to growth. Self-awareness strengthens this resilience. By recognizing personal limitations, individuals avoid overestimating their readiness. Overconfidence often leads to careless mistakes, while honest evaluation encourages preparation. At the same time, awareness of strengths builds grounded confidence. This balance between humility and self-trust prevents both arrogance and self-doubt. Gradually, the concept of power becomes less dramatic and more practical. It appears in everyday choices: maintaining calm during disagreement, listening fully before responding, preparing thoroughly before important moments, and acting with integrity even when shortcuts seem tempting. These small expressions of discipline accumulate, shaping reputation and reliability. Ethical responsibility becomes inseparable from influence. Actions motivated by ego may produce temporary gains but often damage long-term stability. Decisions guided by fairness and foresight create sustainable progress. Responsibility ensures that influence benefits more than just the individual wielding it. This mature understanding reframes ambition itself. Success no longer means accumulating control but creating constructive impact. Influence becomes a tool for improvement rather than domination. Personal growth aligns with contribution, and achievement feels more meaningful when it strengthens both self and community. Over time, what began as fascination with hidden systems evolves into appreciation for practical wisdom. The symbols that once suggested mysterious authority now point toward everyday mastery of attention, emotion, and intention. Power reveals itself not as something extraordinary but as something expressed through consistent, thoughtful behavior. And just as balance begins to feel natural, human life, at a certain stage, the idea of mastery begins to lose its sharp edges and take on a quieter, more reflective tone. What once felt like a destination starts to feel more like an ongoing relationship with awareness itself. The need to prove control fades, replaced by a deeper interest in understanding how influence actually moves through everyday life. This shift brings a kind of calm clarity. It becomes less about reaching a final state of power and more about refining how one shows up in each moment. One of the most subtle but important realizations is that influence often works best when it is almost invisible. The strongest presence in a room is not always the loudest or most forceful. It is often the person who listens carefully, speaks with precision, and acts with intention. Their steadiness creates trust. Their consistency builds credibility. Over time, this quiet reliability carries more weight than dramatic displays of authority. This idea challenges the common assumption that power must be obvious to be effective. In reality, overt control can create resistance. People tend to push back when they feel pressured or dominated. But when influence is expressed through clarity, respect, and understanding, it feels natural rather than imposed. It allows others to participate willingly, which creates stronger and more lasting outcomes. Attention becomes one of the most valuable forms of power in this context. Where attention goes, energy follows. A distracted mind spreads itself thin, reacting to whatever demands immediate focus. But a directed mind chooses where to invest its energy. It prioritizes what truly matters and lets go of what does not. This selective attention shapes results over time. It determines what grows and what fades. There is also a growing awareness of how easily attention can be captured and manipulated. Modern environments are filled with distractions designed to pull focus in multiple directions. Without discipline, it becomes difficult to maintain clarity. This makes the practice of intentional focus even more valuable. Protecting attention becomes an act of self-leadership. It ensures that decisions are guided by purpose rather than impulse. Alongside attention, intention gains greater importance. Actions without clear intention often lead to scattered results. Effort is expended, but progress feels inconsistent. When intention is defined, actions align more naturally. Each step supports a larger direction. This alignment reduces friction and increases efficiency, making progress feel more coherent and sustainable. Another layer of understanding emerges around the idea of acceptance. Not everything can or should be controlled. Some variables remain outside personal influence, no matter how much effort is applied. Resisting this reality creates frustration. Accepting it creates freedom. It allows energy to be redirected toward areas where it can have meaningful impact. Acceptance does not mean resignation. It means recognizing the boundaries of influence and working intelligently within them. This distinction is crucial. It prevents wasted effort and encourages strategic thinking. By focusing on what can be shaped, individuals become more effective and less emotionally drained. There is also a deeper appreciation for the role of uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty may have felt like something to eliminate. Now it begins to appear as an inevitable part of growth. New opportunities, ideas, and directions often emerge from situations that are not fully predictable. Learning to operate within uncertainty requires adaptability. It encourages curiosity rather than fear. Adaptability strengthens resilience. When plans change or unexpected challenges arise, a flexible mindset allows for adjustment without losing direction. This reduces stress and keeps progress moving forward. It transforms obstacles into opportunities for refinement rather than reasons to stop. Relationships also take on a more central role in this stage of understanding. Influence is rarely exercised in isolation. It exists within networks of people, each with their own perspectives, motivations, and experiences. Recognizing this complexity encourages empathy. It shifts communication from persuasion to connection. When people feel genuinely understood, collaboration becomes easier and more effective. Trust becomes a form of long-term power. It cannot be forced or quickly manufactured. It grows through consistent actions over time. Each decision either strengthens or weakens it. Once established, trust simplifies interactions. It reduces the need for constant explanation or justification. It creates a foundation where influence can operate smoothly. As these ideas settle, the concept of control becomes more refined. Adaptability. It allows progress without rigidity. In the end, what once appeared as a complex system of external authority reveals itself as a deeply practical philosophy of living. It speaks to how a person manages attention, intention, relationships, and uncertainty. It shows that influence is not something separate from daily life but something expressed through every choice, every reaction, and every interaction. And just when this understanding begins to feel complete, another question naturally arises, not about how to gain or use influence, but about how to sustain it over time without losing clarity, integrity, or the sense of purpose that gave it meaning in the first place. Sustaining influence over time turns out to be a far more delicate art than gaining it in the first place. In the beginning, progress often feels driven by effort, discipline, and a strong sense of direction. But as stability forms and results begin to show, a new challenge quietly appears. Familiarity can dull awareness. Success can introduce complacency. What once required focus can start to feel automatic, and it is in this subtle shift that clarity begins to fade if it is not carefully maintained. Long-term steadiness depends on the ability to remain attentive even when things are going well. It is easy to stay sharp during difficulty because challenges demand engagement. But when conditions feel stable, the mind tends to relax its standards. Small compromises slip in unnoticed. Attention drifts. Intentions become less precise. Over time, these minor shifts accumulate, gradually weakening the very foundation that created success. This is where the idea of continuous awareness becomes essential. It is not about constant tension or overthinking, but about maintaining a quiet connection to one's own thinking and behavior. A person who sustains influence does not assume they have everything under control. Instead, they keep observing, adjusting, and refining. They treat stability not as a final achievement but as something that requires ongoing care. There is also a deeper relationship with humility that begins to develop at this stage. Early progress can create a sense of certainty. Things seem clear, and decisions feel effective. But over time, experience reveals how complex and unpredictable life can be. Situations change. People evolve. New challenges emerge that do not fit previous patterns. Humility allows a person to stay open to learning rather than becoming rigid in their thinking. Without humility, influence becomes fragile. It may appear strong on the surface, but it lacks the flexibility needed to adapt. Rigid thinking struggles when conditions shift. It resists new information and clings to outdated assumptions. This creates blind spots that can lead to avoidable mistakes. In contrast, a humble mindset remains curious. It continues to question, explore, and adjust. Another important realization is that energy must be managed carefully. Influence requires effort, and effort draws from limited mental and emotional resources. Without balance, even the most disciplined individual can experience fatigue. When energy drops, clarity weakens. Decisions become reactive. Patience decreases. Over time, this leads to inconsistency. Sustaining effectiveness, therefore, depends not only on focus but also on recovery. Rest, reflection, and periods of disengagement are not distractions from progress, they are part of it. They allow the mind to reset, making it easier to return with renewed clarity. This rhythm between effort and recovery prevents burnout and supports long-term stability. The role of reflection becomes more pronounced as well. Regularly stepping back to evaluate actions, decisions, and outcomes helps maintain alignment with intention. Without reflection, it is easy to drift into patterns that no longer serve a meaningful purpose. Reflection acts as a form of internal calibration. It ensures that direction remains intentional rather than accidental. Over time, a person also becomes more aware of the influence they have on others. Actions, attitudes, and decisions create ripple effects. Even small behaviors can shape the environment around them. This awareness strengthens the sense of responsibility. Influence is no longer seen as a personal asset alone but as something that affects a broader system. This perspective encourages more thoughtful decision-making. Short-term gains are weighed against long-term consequences. Immediate benefits are considered alongside their wider impact. This broader view leads to more sustainable choices, reinforcing stability rather than undermining it. There is also a growing understanding that not all influence should be exercised. Just because something can be controlled does not mean it should to function more naturally. Trust plays a central role in this balance. When trust is established, there is less need for constant intervention. Others can operate with autonomy, reducing the burden on a single point of control. This distributed form of influence is more resilient because it does not rely entirely on one person's continuous input. As these layers come together, influence begins to feel less like an effort and more like a state of alignment. Actions flow more naturally because they are grounded in clear intention, steady awareness, and balanced energy. There is less friction, less urgency, and more consistency. In the end, sustaining influence is not about holding on tightly but about staying connected to awareness, to purpose, and to the evolving nature of reality itself. It is a process of continuous adjustment, guided by clarity and supported by humility. And just as this rhythm of awareness and balance begins to settle into something stable, a final layer of understanding starts to emerge, one that shifts the focus away from influence altogether and toward something even more fundamental about how a person chooses to live. Eventually, the focus moves beyond influence, beyond control, and even beyond the idea of mastery itself. What begins to matter more is the quality of one's way of living, not in a moral or idealistic sense, but in a deeply practical way. How clearly one sees, how calmly one responds, and how consistently one acts in alignment with what truly matters. At this stage, there is a noticeable shift from doing to being. Earlier, much of the effort was directed toward shaping outcomes, improving skills, and refining behavior. Now, attention turns toward the underlying state from which all actions emerge. Because over time, it becomes obvious that actions are only as stable as the mindset behind them. A scattered mind produces scattered results, no matter how strong the intention. A clear and grounded mind, on the other hand, brings coherence even to complex situations. This realization simplifies things in an unexpected way. Instead of constantly trying to adjust external conditions, the focus narrows to maintaining internal clarity. When perception is accurate and emotions are steady, decisions naturally improve. There is less need to force outcomes because actions align more naturally with reality. Clarity, however, is not something that appears once and remains forever. It requires ongoing attention. The mind has a tendency to drift toward distraction, assumption, and habit. Without noticing, people begin to operate on autopilot, repeating patterns that may no longer serve them. Staying aware of this drift is part of maintaining a high level of functioning. One of the most powerful tools in this stage is simplicity. Complexity often creates the illusion of control, but it can also hide confusion. When thinking becomes overly complicated, it becomes harder to see what truly matters. Simplifying does not mean ignoring detail, it means focusing on what is essential and letting go of what is not. This approach sharpens decision-making. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions, attention remains centered on a few meaningful priorities. This reduces internal conflict and increases consistency. Over time, consistent actions build a sense of quiet confidence, not based on outcomes alone, but on the reliability of one's own process. There is also a deeper comfort with uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty may have felt like something to eliminate or manage tightly. Now it is understood as a natural part of life that does not need to be fully resolved. This reduces unnecessary tension. It allows a person to move forward without needing perfect clarity about every possible outcome. With this comfort comes a stronger sense of presence. Instead of constantly projecting into the future or revisiting the past, attention rests more fully in the current moment. This does not mean ignoring long-term thinking, but rather not being consumed by it. Presence improves perception. It allows details to be noticed, conversations to be understood more deeply, and opportunities to be recognized as they arise. Relationships benefit significantly from this shift. When a person is fully present, communication becomes more genuine. There is less filtering, less hidden agenda, and more direct understanding. This creates stronger connections and reduces unnecessary conflict. People respond positively to clarity and sincerity because it builds trust naturally. Another important aspect is the alignment between values and behavior. Over time, inconsistencies become more visible. Actions that contradict deeper priorities create internal tension. Addressing this tension leads to greater integrity, behavior to fit different situations. Instead, there is a consistent way of operating that adapts naturally without losing its core direction. This consistency reduces mental strain and builds a reputation of reliability. There is also a growing appreciation for limits. Energy, time, and attention are all finite. Trying to extend them beyond their natural capacity leads to diminishing returns. Recognizing limits allows for better allocation of resources. It encourages rest when needed and focused effort when it matters most. In a way, this stage brings everything back to something very simple. Not easy, but simple. Pay attention. Stay clear. Act with intention. Adjust when necessary. Let go when appropriate. These principles, while straightforward, require continuous awareness to apply consistently. And as this simplicity settles in, the entire journey takes on a different meaning. What once seemed like a path toward gaining power reveals itself as a process of removing confusion. What once felt like an effort to control the external world becomes a practice of understanding the internal one. In the end, nothing dramatic is left to achieve. There is no final state to reach where everything becomes perfect or complete. Instead, there is an ongoing way of engaging with life, clear, steady, and responsive. And in that quiet steadiness, a final insight begins to take shape, that perhaps the greatest form of power was never about influence at all, but about the ability to remain grounded, aware, and fully present, regardless of what changes or unfolds. What remains at the very end of this journey is not a technique, not a system, and not even a philosophy in the traditional sense. It is something far quieter and more enduring, a way of seeing. A way of moving through life without being constantly pulled by every impulse, fear, or desire that arises. The search that may have begun with curiosity about power gradually dissolves into a deeper understanding of presence, awareness, and restraint. There is a certain clarity that comes when a person no longer feels the need to control everything. Control, in its earlier form, often comes from discomfort with uncertainty. It is an attempt to secure outcomes, to eliminate risk, to create a predictable path forward. But life rarely follows strict patterns, and trying to force it into one often creates more tension than stability. Letting go of excessive control does not mean becoming passive. It means recognizing where effort is useful and where it becomes counterproductive. This creates a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence that everything will go according to plan, but the confidence that one can respond effectively to whatever happens. It is a quieter, more resilient form of self-trust. Instead of relying on perfect conditions, it relies on the ability to adapt, to stay composed, and to think clearly even when circumstances are uncertain. At this point, awareness becomes the central anchor. Not awareness as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience, noticing thoughts as they arise, observing emotions without immediately reacting to them, and staying connected to the present moment without drifting too far into speculation or assumption. This kind of awareness creates space. And in that space, better decisions naturally emerge. There is also a noticeable reduction in unnecessary conflict. Much of the tension people experience comes from resisting what is already happening or reacting too quickly without understanding the full picture. When awareness increases, reactions slow down. Situations are seen more completely. This often reveals that what seemed like a problem was partially shaped by perception itself. Adjusting perception can sometimes resolve tension more effectively than trying to force external change. Another quiet shift happens in the relationship with ambition. Ambition does not disappear, but it becomes more refined. It is no longer driven purely by comparison, urgency, or external validation. Instead, it aligns more closely with personal values and long-term direction. This makes effort feel more meaningful and less exhausting. There is less pressure to constantly prove something, and more focus on building something of substance. Time also begins to feel different. When attention is scattered, time feels fragmented and often insufficient. But when attention is focused and deliberate, time feels more expansive. Even within the same number of hours, the quality of engagement changes the experience completely. This reinforces the idea that how one uses attention matters more than how much time one has. There is a deeper sense of independence in this stage as well. Not isolation, but independence from constant external influence. Opinions, internal reference point. Gratitude begins to appear more naturally, not as a forced practice but as a byproduct of awareness. When attention is present, small details become more noticeable, moments of calm, meaningful conversations, quiet progress. These experiences might have always been there, but without awareness, they were often overlooked. Recognizing them adds a sense of richness to everyday life. There is also a greater acceptance of imperfection, both in oneself and in the world. Earlier, imperfections may have felt like problems to fix immediately. Now they are seen as part of a larger process. This reduces unnecessary frustration and creates more patience. Growth continues, but without the constant pressure of needing everything to be resolved instantly. In many ways, the journey circles back to where it began, but with a completely different understanding. What once appeared complex and hidden now feels simple and visible. Not because the world has changed, but because perception has. The symbols, structures, and ideas that once seemed like tools for gaining power reveal themselves as mirrors, reflecting patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. They point inward rather than outward. And once that is understood, the need for external frameworks becomes less important. What remains is a steady way of engaging with life, observing without rushing, acting without forcing, adjusting without losing direction. It is not dramatic, and it does not seek attention, but it is deeply effective. And in that quiet effectiveness, the original question, how to gain power, fades completely, replaced by something far more grounded. How to live with clarity, respond with intention, and move through an unpredictable world without losing balance. In the end, what feels most striking is how far the journey has moved from where it began. What may have started as a search for hidden power, influence, or control gradually reveals itself as something far more grounded and quietly transformative. The fascination with external forces fades, not because it was meaningless, but because it served its purpose. It acted as an entry point, a way to begin exploring deeper questions about awareness, intention, and the nature of human experience itself. There is a kind of maturity that settles in when a person no longer feels the need to chase complexity. Earlier, complexity can feel almost like proof that something is powerful or valuable. But over time, it becomes clear that complexity often hides confusion, while clarity tends to look simple on the surface. This does not make it easy. In fact, simplicity often requires more discipline than complexity, but it makes it real. It can be applied, lived, and tested in everyday situations. At this stage, decisions begin to feel less like internal battles and more like natural extensions of understanding. When priorities are clear and attention is steady, choices do not require constant overthinking. There is less second guessing, less hesitation. Not because uncertainty has disappeared, but because the relationship with uncertainty has changed. It is no longer something to fear, but something to work with. This creates a sense of flow in how life is approached. Actions follow understanding, rather than being driven by impulse or pressure. When adjustments are needed, they happen without resistance. This flexibility makes progress more sustainable. Instead of moving in bursts of effort followed by periods of confusion, there is a more consistent rhythm. There is also a deeper recognition of cause and effect, not in a rigid or mechanical sense, but in a practical, observable way. Thoughts influence perception. Perception influences decisions. Decisions influence outcomes. This chain becomes easier to notice with increased awareness. And once it is seen clearly, it becomes possible to intervene at earlier stages, adjusting thinking patterns before they turn into actions that create unwanted results. This awareness naturally leads to greater responsibility, not in a heavy or burdensome way, but in a grounded understanding that one's internal state plays a significant role in shaping external experiences. Blame becomes less useful. Instead of focusing on what is outside of control, attention shifts toward what can be influenced directly: perception, response, and behavior. With this shift, emotional reactions also begin to change. Situations that once triggered immediate frustration or anxiety are now approached with more space. This does not mean emotions disappear, but they are experienced differently. They pass through rather than taking over. This creates a sense of stability that is not dependent on circumstances always being favorable. Relationships benefit from this, defend or prove a point. This creates an environment where mutual respect can grow more naturally. Another quiet change appears in how success is defined. Earlier, success may have been tied to visible outcomes, achievements, recognition, control over situations. Now, it becomes more internal. Success is reflected in clarity of thought, consistency of action, and the ability to remain steady under pressure. External results still matter, but they are no longer the only measure. This shift reduces unnecessary pressure. When success is defined only by outcomes, it can feel unstable because outcomes are influenced by many variables. But when success includes the quality of one's process, it becomes more within reach and more consistent. This creates a sense of progress that is not easily disrupted. There is also a growing comfort with the idea that not everything needs to be fully understood. Earlier, there may have been a strong desire to explain everything, to find clear answers for every situation. Now, there is more acceptance of ambiguity. Some aspects of life remain open-ended, and that is not a problem to solve. It is simply part of the experience. This acceptance frees up mental energy. Instead of chasing complete certainty, attention can focus on what is immediately relevant and actionable. This makes thinking more efficient and less strained. In many ways, the journey resolves into something very grounded. Pay attention to what is happening. Understand your own reactions. Act with intention. Adjust when needed. Let go when holding on creates unnecessary tension. These ideas are not complicated, but applying them consistently creates a noticeable difference over time. And as everything settles into this steady rhythm, there is a final sense of perspective that begins to take shape, that the real value was never in discovering something hidden or extraordinary, but in learning how to engage with ordinary life in a way that is clear, balanced, and deeply aware. By the time everything settles, there is a quiet recognition that nothing was ever as distant or mysterious as it first appeared. The search, with all its layers of symbolism and intensity, ultimately circles back to something very close and very familiar: the simple experience of being aware, making choices, and living with their consequences. What once felt like a path toward something hidden now feels like a return to something obvious that had been overlooked. There is a certain ease that begins to replace the earlier sense of effort. Not because challenges disappear, but because the relationship with them has changed. Difficulty is no longer immediately labeled as a problem. It is seen as part of movement, part of growth, part of the ongoing process of adjusting to reality. This removes a layer of resistance that used to make situations feel heavier than they actually were. Clarity, at this point, feels less like something that has to be created and more like something that is revealed when unnecessary noise is removed. Much of the confusion people experience comes from overthinking, from reacting too quickly, or from holding on to assumptions that are no longer accurate. When those patterns are noticed and gradually reduced, understanding begins to surface on its own. This is why awareness remains central even at the end. It is not a tool that gets used and then set aside. It becomes a constant background presence, observing, adjusting, refining. It allows a person to stay connected to what is actually happening rather than getting lost in interpretation or expectation. There is also a deeper sense of trust that develops, but it is not blind trust. It is grounded in experience. After repeatedly seeing that calm observation leads to better decisions than impulsive reaction, confidence begins to build naturally. After noticing that patience often produces stronger outcomes than force, there is less urgency to rush. This kind of trust is stable because it is based on direct understanding rather than assumption. The idea of control, which may have once felt central, now appears more limited in scope. Control exists, but only within certain boundaries. A person can guide their actions, shape their responses, and influence their direction, but they cannot determine every outcome. Accepting this limitation does not weaken effectiveness, it sharpens it. It directs energy toward what can actually be shaped instead of wasting it on what cannot. This creates a more efficient way of living. Effort becomes more targeted. Decisions become more deliberate. There is less wasted motion, both mentally and physically. Over time, this efficiency builds momentum, making progress feel smoother and more sustainable. There is also a quiet shift in how one relates to the idea of meaning. Earlier, engagement itself. When attention is present and actions are aligned with intention, even simple moments carry a sense of completeness. Meaning is no longer something distant, it is embedded in how each moment is approached. This does not remove ambition or the desire to improve. Those qualities remain, but they are no longer driven by restlessness or dissatisfaction. Instead, they are guided by curiosity and a natural inclination toward growth. This makes effort feel lighter, more sustainable, and less tied to pressure. There is also a greater sense of continuity. Life is no longer divided so sharply into successes and failures, gains and losses. Each experience becomes part of a larger process. Setbacks contribute to understanding. Progress builds on previous effort. Everything connects in a way that feels less fragmented. This perspective reduces fear of making mistakes. When mistakes are seen as part of learning rather than as final judgments, it becomes easier to take thoughtful risks and explore new directions. This openness supports ongoing growth without creating unnecessary stress. Relationships, too, become simpler and more grounded. There is less need to manage impressions or control outcomes. Communication becomes more direct. Listening becomes more genuine. This creates interactions that are more stable and less influenced by hidden tension. In the end, nothing dramatic announces itself as a final conclusion. There is no clear line where everything suddenly becomes complete. Instead, there is a steady state of engagement, clear, responsive, and balanced. Life continues to change, challenges continue to arise, and uncertainty remains present. But the way these are experienced is different. What began as a search for power resolves into an understanding of presence. What began as an attempt to influence the unknown becomes a practice of engaging with the known more effectively. And what once felt complex and distant becomes something simple, direct, and always available. And in that simplicity, the journey finds its natural conclusion, not as an ending, but as a way of moving forward with clarity, steadiness, and a quiet confidence that does not need to prove itself. Even after everything feels resolved, life has a way of continuing the conversation in quieter, more subtle ways. There is no final point where growth stops or understanding becomes complete. Instead, what remains is an ongoing refinement, a gentle process of noticing, adjusting, and deepening awareness as new situations unfold. The difference now is that this process no longer feels confusing or overwhelming. It feels natural, almost expected. One of the most noticeable changes at this stage is how little effort it takes to return to clarity after being pulled away from it. Distraction still happens. Emotions still rise. Moments of frustration or uncertainty still appear, but they no longer carry the same weight. There is a quicker recognition of what is happening, and with that recognition comes the ability to reset. Instead of being carried too far by reaction, there is a quiet return to balance. This ability to return, again and again, becomes more valuable than the idea of never losing balance at all. Because in reality, no one maintains perfect awareness at all times. What matters is not perfection, but recovery. The shorter the distance between losing clarity and regaining it, the more stable life begins to feel overall. There is also a deeper sense of ease in decision-making. Earlier, decisions may have felt heavy, filled with second-guessing and concern about outcomes. Now, they are approached more directly. Not because every answer is obvious, but because there is trust in the process of thinking clearly and adjusting when needed. This reduces hesitation. It allows action to happen without unnecessary delay. Another subtle shift appears in how effort is experienced. Effort is still required. Nothing meaningful happens without it, but it no longer feels forced. When actions align with clear intention, effort becomes more fluid. There is less internal resistance. Tasks that once felt draining may now feel engaging simply because they are approached with the right mindset. This alignment also makes it easier to recognize when something is not worth pursuing. Not every opportunity deserves attention. Not every path leads to meaningful progress. Being able to step back and say no without doubt is a form of clarity that protects both time and energy. It prevents unnecessary complexity from entering life. There is also a growing sense of independence from constant evaluation. Earlier, there may have been a tendency to measure progress frequently, to question whether things were moving fast enough or in the right direction. Now, they carry more value as well, not as breaks from productivity, but as essential parts of it. In stillness, patterns become clearer, thoughts settle, insights emerge without force. These moments provide perspective that is difficult to access when constantly moving or reacting. There is also a noticeable shift in how challenges are approached. Instead of immediately trying to solve or eliminate them, there is often a pause to understand them more fully. This deeper observation reveals underlying causes that might otherwise be missed. Addressing these root causes leads to more effective solutions. Over time, this approach builds a sense of quiet confidence. Not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that comes from repeated experience. Seeing that clarity leads to better outcomes, that patience reduces unnecessary mistakes, and that awareness prevents escalation, these patterns reinforce themselves. Confidence grows naturally as a result. Relationships continue to benefit from this steadiness. There is less need to react defensively or prove a point. Conversations become more about understanding than winning. This creates a more stable and respectful dynamic with others. there is also a greater acceptance of change. Earlier, change may have felt disruptive or uncomfortable. Now, it is recognized as a constant. Instead of resisting it, there is a readiness to adapt. This flexibility reduces friction and allows smoother transitions between different phases of life. In many ways, what remains is a kind of quiet discipline. Not strict or rigid, but consistent. Paying attention, acting with intention, adjusting when necessary, letting go when holding on no longer serves a purpose. These patterns become habits that require less conscious effort over time. And as all of this settles into something steady and reliable, one final realization gently surfaces, that the journey never truly ends, not because something is missing, but because awareness itself continues to deepen, offering new layers of understanding in even the most familiar moments of life. In the very end, what becomes clear is that there was never a final answer waiting to be found, no ultimate state where everything would suddenly make perfect sense and remain that way forever. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance that clarity is something living, something that moves and evolves along with experience. It is not something you arrive at once, but something you return to, again and again, with a little more depth each time. This changes the entire feeling of the journey. What once may have felt like a search with a destination now feels more like a rhythm, a continuous process of observing, understanding, and adjusting. There is no pressure to finish anything. There is simply the ongoing opportunity to engage with life more clearly. One of the most grounding realizations at this stage is how little is actually needed to live well. Not in terms of material things, but in terms of mental approach. A clear mind, steady attention, and thoughtful action are enough to navigate even complex situations. Everything else, the noise, the urgency, the constant need for more, begins to feel less essential. This simplicity does not reduce the richness of life. In fact, it enhances it. When attention is not scattered, even ordinary moments become more vivid. Conversations feel more meaningful. Small progress feels more satisfying. There is a greater sense of connection to what is happening right now, rather than always reaching for something else. There is also a deeper sense of stability that no longer depends heavily on external conditions. Situations still change. Some are favorable, others are not. But the internal response becomes more consistent. This creates a kind of steadiness that remains even when circumstances are uncertain. It is not that challenges disappear, but they no longer disrupt everything in the same way. At the same time, there is a quiet understanding that growth does not require constant intensity. Earlier, there may have been a belief that progress must always feel active, driven, and visible. Now it becomes clear that growth often happens in quieter ways, through reflection, through small adjustments, through simply paying closer attention over time. This removes a lot of unnecessary pressure. There is no longer a need to push constantly or to measure every step. Progress becomes something that unfolds naturally when awareness is present and actions are aligned with intention. There is also a sense of lightness that develops. Not because life becomes easy, but because there is less internal resistance. Much of the weight people carry comes from trying to control too much, from holding on to expectations too tightly, or from reacting too quickly. Decisions are still made carefully, but there is less fear of making mistakes. Mistakes are no longer seen as failures, but as part of the process of refining understanding. This creates a more open and flexible way of moving forward. Relationships, too, become more natural. There is less need to manage how things appear and more focus on being present and genuine. This simplicity strengthens connection without requiring effort or strategy. And perhaps most importantly, there is a growing comfort with not knowing everything. Earlier, uncertainty may have felt like something to solve or eliminate. Now, it is simply part of the landscape. This acceptance creates a sense of ease that allows curiosity to remain alive without turning into anxiety. In a quiet way, everything comes back to awareness. Not as a concept, but as a lived experience, noticing what is happening, internally and externally, without immediately trying to change it. From that awareness, better responses naturally emerge. There is less force, less confusion, and more clarity. Nothing about this is dramatic. There are no sudden transformations or final conclusions that change everything overnight. Instead, there is a steady, grounded way of living that continues to deepen over time. And in that steady awareness, the entire journey finds its meaning, not in reaching some distant point, but in learning how to move through each moment with clarity, balance, and a quiet sense of understanding that continues to grow, without needing to arrive anywhere at all. And after everything has been explored, understood, and slowly integrated, what remains is not a grand conclusion, but a kind of quiet return to ordinary life, except now, it is no longer seen as ordinary. The same moments exist, the same routines, the same interactions, but the way they are experienced has changed in a subtle yet profound way. There is a deeper sense of presence in simple things. A conversation is no longer just an exchange of words, but something to be fully noticed. A decision is no longer rushed, but observed as it forms. Even moments of stillness, which may have once felt unproductive, now carry a kind of quiet value. Nothing external has necessarily changed, yet the quality of experience feels richer, more grounded. What becomes clear is that nothing was ever hidden in the way it once seemed. The sense of mystery came not from the world itself, but from the way attention was scattered, from how quickly the mind moved past what was already in front of it. When attention stabilizes, when awareness becomes steady, much of that mystery dissolves, not into something less interesting, but into something more real. There is also a noticeable reduction in inner conflict. Earlier, different parts of the mind often pulled in different directions, desire competing with doubt, ambition clashing with fear, impulse interrupting intention. Now, there is more alignment. Thoughts, actions, and priorities begin to move in the same direction. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it reduces unnecessary friction. With that alignment comes a sense of quiet confidence. Not confidence based on always being right, but on being able to face situations clearly and respond thoughtfully. There is less need to prove anything, less urgency to control how things unfold. Instead, there is trust in the ability to engage with whatever arises. This trust changes how the future is viewed. It is no longer something to be tightly controlled or predicted in detail. It becomes something to move toward with awareness and adaptability. Plans still exist, but they are held more lightly. Adjustments are made without resistance when needed. There is also a deeper appreciation for the present moment, not as an abstract idea, but as the only place where life actually happens. The past becomes a source of learning, the future a direction for movement, but neither pulls attention away from what is happening now. This balance creates a sense of stability that is not dependent on circumstances. Another subtle but important shift is the way effort is directed. Instead of trying to manage everything at once, attention focuses on what is immediately relevant. This reduces overwhelm and increases effectiveness. One step is taken clearly, then the next. Progress becomes steady rather than scattered. There is also an understanding that clarity does not require constant thinking. In fact, too much thinking can create confusion. Clear perception often comes from quiet observation rather than analysis. This does not mean avoiding thought, but using it when needed rather than letting it run continuously without direction. Over time, this creates a more efficient and less strained way of living. Energy is not wasted on unnecessary need to control outcomes. This allows connections to develop more naturally. Misunderstandings still occur, but they are handled with more awareness and less escalation. And perhaps most importantly, there is a sense that nothing needs to be added to make life complete. Growth continues, goals remain, and challenges appear, but there is no longer a feeling that something essential is missing. There is a quiet completeness in simply being aware, engaged, and aligned. In this way, the entire journey resolves not into a final answer, but into a different way of moving forward. One that is less driven by urgency, less shaped by confusion, and more grounded in clarity. And as this way of living settles into something natural, one last understanding gently lingers, that everything that was sought from the beginning was never somewhere else to be found, but was always present, waiting to be recognized in the way one sees, thinks, and lives each moment. And in the final stretch of reflection, even the idea of a journey begins to soften. What once felt like movement from one stage to another now appears more like layers of understanding unfolding within the same life, the same mind, the same everyday experiences. Nothing was ever separate from where you already were. The only thing that changed was how clearly you could see it. There is something quietly liberating in that realization. It removes the pressure to keep searching, to keep chasing something distant or undefined. Instead, it brings attention back to what is already here, your thoughts as they arise, your reactions as they form, your choices as they shape direction. Life stops feeling like a puzzle to solve and starts feeling like something to participate in more fully. This shift also changes how effort is experienced at the deepest level. Effort no longer comes from a place of lack, as if something essential is missing and must be acquired. It comes from engagement, from interest, from a natural inclination to do things well, to understand more clearly, to respond more thoughtfully. This kind of effort feels sustainable because it is not driven by pressure. There is also a growing sense that clarity does not need to be protected in a fragile way. Earlier, it might have seemed like something that could easily be lost, something that required constant control to maintain. Now, it feels more stable. Even when moments of distraction or confusion appear, they pass more easily. Clarity returns not because it is forced, but because it has become familiar. This familiarity creates a kind of inner steadiness that does not depend heavily on external conditions. Situations can change quickly, plans can shift, unexpected challenges can arise. but the internal response remains more consistent. There is less swinging between extremes, less being pulled completely off balance. At the same time, there is a deeper respect for the unpredictability of life. Not everything can be anticipated. Not everything can be managed. And that is no longer a problem to fix. It becomes part of the experience itself. This acceptance removes a layer of tension that often goes unnoticed until it is gone. There is also a quiet refinement in how attention is used. Instead of being drawn automatically toward whatever is loudest or most urgent, attention becomes more intentional. It is placed where it matters, where it creates value, where it aligns with direction. This makes actions more effective without requiring more effort. In relationships, this refinement shows up as presence and sincerity. There is less performance, less need to control how one is perceived. Interactions become more straightforward. This does not mean they are always easy, but they are more real, and that authenticity tends to create stronger, more stable connections over time. Another important realization is how little control was ever truly needed. Much of what felt like control was actually tension, an attempt to hold everything in place, to prevent change, to avoid uncertainty. Letting go of that tension does not lead to chaos. It often leads to better outcomes because actions become more responsive and less forced. There is also a sense of continuity that ties everything together. Past experiences, present awareness, and future direction no longer feel disconnected. They become part of a single, ongoing process. This creates a feeling of coherence, where life is not a series of separate events but a continuous flow of learning and adjustment. Even the idea of improvement takes on a different meaning. It is no longer about becoming something entirely new, but about seeing more clearly, acting more consistently, and aligning more closely with what already feels true. Growth becomes less about adding and more about the ability to pay attention, to understand, to act, and to adjust. Life continues, as it always has, with its changes, its challenges, and its unpredictability. But the way it is met has shifted completely. There is more space, more clarity, and less unnecessary resistance. And that, in the end, is what everything seems to point toward, not mastery over anything external, but a steady, grounded way of being that remains clear and responsive, no matter what comes next. And when everything finally grows quiet, what remains is not an answer, but a way of seeing that no longer needs questions in the same way as before. The urge to figure everything out begins to settle. Not because everything is understood, but because it no longer feels necessary to understand everything in order to move forward with clarity. There is a kind of stillness here that is not forced. It does not come from withdrawing from life or avoiding complexity. It comes from no longer being internally pulled in too many directions at once. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, situations still change, but they pass through a space that is more stable than before. This stability does not announce itself loudly. It is felt in small, consistent ways. In the pause before responding. In the ability to listen without immediately forming a reply. In the choice to step back when something does not require action. These moments are subtle, but they shape everything. What becomes clear is that much of what once felt urgent was not actually necessary. The need to react immediately, to resolve everything quickly, to have clear answers at all times, these impulses lose their intensity. In their place, there is a more measured pace. Things are allowed to unfold. Decisions are made when they are ready, not rushed into existence. This creates a different relationship with time. Time no longer feels like something that is constantly slipping away. Instead, it feels more spacious. There is enough room to think, to act, and to rest without feeling like something important is being missed. This shift alone changes the quality of daily life in a noticeable way. There is also a deeper trust in simplicity. Not the kind of simplicity that ignores complexity, but the kind that sees through it. Many situations that once seemed complicated reveal themselves to be made of a few clear elements when observed carefully. This makes it easier to respond without overcomplicating things. In this state, attention becomes steady without effort. It rests where it is placed. It does not jump as quickly between distractions. This steadiness allows for deeper engagement with whatever is being done, whether it is work, conversation, or quiet reflection. There is also a sense that nothing needs to be added to make this moment complete. That does not remove ambition or direction, but it removes the feeling that something is missing right now. This creates a kind of ease that supports both rest and action. Even challenges are experienced differently. They are still present, sometimes difficult, sometimes unexpected, but they are no longer immediately resisted. There is a moment of recognition, of understanding, before action is taken. This often leads to better outcomes because the response is based on clarity rather than reaction. Relationships continue to reflect this inner steadiness. There is less tension, less need to control how interactions unfold. Conversations become more open. Listening becomes more genuine. This creates connections that feel more grounded and less strained. There is also a quiet sense of independence, not from people, but from unnecessary influence. External noise, opinions, pressures, expectations, carries less weight. Decisions are guided more by internal clarity than by external urgency. At this point, even the idea of progress changes. It is no longer measured only by visible results or milestones. It is felt in the consistency of awareness, in the ability to remain steady, in the ease of returning to clarity when it is lost. This makes progress less dramatic but more reliable. And perhaps most importantly, there is no longer a need to hold on to this understanding tightly. Earlier, there might have been a fear of losing clarity, of slipping back into confusion. Now, that fear fades. Clarity is no longer something fragile. It is something that can be returned to, again and again. So nothing grand concludes this. There is no final statement that captures everything, just a quiet continuation. Life moves forward. Moments come and go. Decisions are made. Adjustments happen. And through it all, there is a steady awareness, simple, grounded, and always available, shaping how everything is experienced, without needing to control it.